First of all, I'd like to thank World of Wellness for giving me this opportunity to share my views and opinions as a student having studied in India. And as we know, the topic is education for today. So I'm going to talk about four main things. The first being, what is education and does it evolve? The second is, how has the pandemic impacted students? The third is, how can education online be made more creative? And finally, the changes I would like to see in the space of education for a better world. So let me start with the first one. Okay, you got a slight sneak peek into what's coming up. But let me begin. So, what is education and does it evolve? So, I'm going to ask you to think of the first thing that comes to your mind when I say education, and specifically education in school. So, you all must be picturing your fond memories back in school, your friends, your teachers, your classmates, your books. I don't know, escaping, bunking classes, depending on what kind of student you were. Right? So, what does education mean? So, the dictionary defines education as providing instructions in a systematic manner, and it's typically associated with school or college. And the end result is for a student to be able to learn. Right? So, I'm going to ask you a question for which you can leave the answer in the chat box. And do you think the education system in India is moving towards the right direction? If you think it's yes, you can just type in a yes. If you feel it's no, you can type in a no. And there's really no right or wrong answer. It's all based on your opinions and experiences. Okay. Okay, so I see some no's and some maybes. Right? So since there's no right or wrong answer, it's totally fine. So many people who say no often attribute it to the flaws in the system, right? We have a system that encourages learning by rote or ranking students, or there's a lack of encouragement for sports once you get to higher grades, and you feel like the list is endless. But I'm going to ask you to hold that thought, set that thought aside, and let's picture a blank sheet like this. Okay, and let me add a dot to the sheet. So you can view the sheet in two ways. There's a dot on a white sheet, or there's a dot and there's a lot of space around it. And because there's a dot and the space, it gives me an opportunity to probably make a drawing out of it, right? So let's compare the boards of education we have in India to this dot. And then we realize that there's still a lot that can be done within these boundaries, or much rather along with these boundaries. So there are no rules stating that assemblies are compulsory, that we have to learn by rote, or we have to stand up and greet the teachers, and so on and so forth. Right? So I was very lucky to go to a school in my grades 11 and 12 where we weren't forced to greet our teachers, stand up and greet our teachers. We often greeted them with a hi or a hello. We weren't forced to thank them at the end of each class, but it came very naturally to us. We could sit in other subjects that we hadn't chosen if we had a free period. We had classes under the shade of a tree, and we could play sports in any free period. And we also had a lot of events that we planned ourselves. So we learned a lot of practical hands-on skills. And all of this happened in a school that followed the ICSE curriculum or the ISC board. So that brings me to the second part of the first question. Can education evolve? So in my opinion, the concept of education itself cannot evolve since it's basically imparting knowledge for someone to learn. But the way we approach education can definitely evolve. And this will only happen if we understand why we do what we do. Right? Today in India, you still have many coaching centers that train you for entrance exams, schools that purely focus on academics and nothing else really. But there's still hope because there are many schools that are trying to create systems that establish reasons for why they do what they do. And they look towards balancing life skills along with academics. And I think the pandemic has given us this opportunity to re-look at why we do what we do. Right, so let's look at the impact of COVID on students. So on the surface, really, we switched from a traditional blackboard to a whiteboard on Zoom meetings. But let me take you through this through some comic panels that I illustrated. So in the beginning, it seemed very nice for us students. You could wake up like 5 minutes before class, wake up 5 minutes after class also, and you always had network issues to blame on, and all was forgiven. Right? We learned how to pair shirts with extremely casual clothing, and we were ready for any class. But what also happened is that we had a lot of free time on our hands, and many of us used this time to enroll ourselves in other classes and learn new skills. And while all this was happening, we started becoming more and more reliant on our screens and on Zoom. Any kind of interaction with our friends also happened on Zoom, and any of the other classes that you attended was also on Zoom. So eventually, many of us felt very frustrated and sick and tired of using the screen or using Zoom as a platform. So it's really not as easy as that math formula that we learn is A plus B is equal to B plus A. We couldn't take conventional educational methods that were used offline and simply apply them online, right? So for it to be impactful, we had to make certain changes. And this gave us this opportunity for education to be made more creative. So how can we do this when it's online? So let's go back to the basics and let's look at the meaning of education, right? So it's kind of established that it means to impart knowledge for someone to learn. So let's break this down even further. And I want you to try and trace back the sources of where you learned what you know from. So think about how you learned to use cutlery, how you learned to ride a bicycle, right? Why you hold certain opinions. So we learn a lot from movies, media, music, sports, also from experiences and conditioning, and simply observing things around us. So if I ask you to picture where you learn in school, where you learn from, you might once again go back to your classroom, your blackboard, your textbooks, and in a very closed environment. But once more people realize that textbooks are not the only place you can learn from, teaching can automatically be made very creative, whether it's online or offline. So let me give you an example. In grade 12, we learned concepts of social psychology, such as stereotypes, prejudices, and biases, by watching clips of the film 12 Angry Men. The examination systems that we have can be entirely rethought of. We also had these sessions called the Eye Opener, where we watched videos about different topics, ranging from learning about the concept of bitcoins to environmental issues, and we had discussions that followed it. We also had the screening of the documentary, The Social Network, and we had a discussion that followed it. We had sessions called Life Skills, where we learned what it takes to open up a bank account, since most of us were moving into college. And we learned how to iron our clothes. We learned how the basics of cooking. And we had speakers come in and speak to us about different things, about what it's like to live with a disability. How do people in smaller towns cope with online education? And along with all of this, we had sections slotted in our timetable where there were no teachers, but it was just for us friends to log in and have a chat. So to bring this all together, what changes can be introduced in the education system for the better or to have a better impact on the world? And these can be done whether it's online or offline. And these ones are easy to remember. They all start with the letter C. So there are 3 C's. The first one being commonality. Right? We as people have a lot in common. So think about what would happen if you broke the idea of putting teachers and principals at a certain pedestal. Now, this doesn't mean to say that we don't respect them, but rather we respect them from a space of love rather than fear. So in our schools, we called our teachers and principal auntie, and they addressed us as kids, beta, bacha, or really whatever other words of affection you use to address your children. So how does this help? This basically reinforces the fact that we're all human and no one is too big or too small to apologize, to initiate change, to pitch in ideas. And this automatically makes relations much like friendships. Right? So this generates the second C automatically, which is collaboration. So why is collaboration so important in a society that is so highly competitive, right? You're always encouraged to be the next best, the next biggest, the next richest, and the list keeps going on. So take a minute to stop and think where this mindset stems from. Apart from the other influences that we have, our schools also play a major role in this. Children are often lauded for being the first in their class, being the best athlete, and you can picture it. But while this may be encouraging for the child who is the best, it creates insecurities for the rest of the students. So for instance, another student who is not naturally good at something, they may not even want to try that activity anymore. So instead, if we encourage acts of kindness, it nurtures the virtue of collaboration. And this automatically generates the third C, which is compassion. We look at problems of poverty, climate change, people bending the law or people breaking the law. And much of this also stems from that competitive mindset. So when we encourage collaboration, we're also instilling compassion in people. So we learn to grow together, uplift others, and become kinder to other people and nature. And this in turn leads to a domino effect for the better. So to bring it all together, to conclude it, we basically saw that education is to impart instructions or knowledge so that one can learn. And the way we approach education would only evolve if we truly understood why we do what we do. And COVID has given us this opportunity to re-look and rethink of our ways of teaching and finding different and more interesting sources of learning. And finally, if we were to encourage the virtues of humility, collaboration, and compassion as a society and in our education system, we could definitely see a much better change. So I like to conclude with a quote I heard recently at a webinar. This is by Charlotte Emma, and she's the co-founder of the Loka School in Bihar. And it goes something like this. If one teacher can adopt these ways, then many teachers can. If many teachers can, a school can. If one school can, many schools can. If many schools can, a nation can. If one nation can, many nations can. And if many nations can, then the whole world can. Thank you.
Thank you, Aditi.
Thank you for sharing those lovely insights.
Thank you.
So, any of the audiences have any questions to Aditi, you can please type it out in the chat box. I think it was a really wonderful session, and my key takeaway would be the 3C model, right? Which is collaboration, commonality, collaboration, and compassion. So That was really very insightful.
Thank you, Aditi. And this is exactly the reason why we have clubbed the stalwarts in the field of education and the students in the field of education, so that when probably
There's an
word of
interchange of
wellness is a
ideas,
connecting bridge between the two.
right? So typically, the teachers look at it from their perspectives, and the students have a totally different perspective. And we thought that it would be a good blend for the teaching faculty and for the student faculty to share the ideas on a common platform. So thank you so much, Aditi. It
Thank you.
was
Thank
indeed
you
a
for
great
the
presentation. Thoroughly enjoyed it.